It's delightful to have an audience here. This is a really special program. Sarah Whiting is a trustee, on the board, and has some skills that are really important in one of the most important aspects of climate impacts, the effects on our rivers. So I will tell you a little bit about Sarah to start. She has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's in water resources engineering, both from Tufts. She has more than 18 years of experience consulting in engineering design, specializing in water and surface water. Her background includes floodplain modeling and mapping, stormwater management permitting and design, critter-friendly stream crossing design, and dam safety. For those who may not be familiar with those are all big deals and takes a lot of skills. Sarah is currently employed at Inter-Fluve, which is an interdisciplinary ecological restoration design firm. She previously worked for the United States Geologic Service in the National Stream Quality Accounting Network program, where she focused on water quality monitoring for the nation's largest rivers. Sarah says she is passionate about working on projects that return balance between humans and wildlife. I love that. She contributed to the Massachusetts design of bridges and culverts for wildlife passage for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. She is currently an active member of the Town of Shirley Planning Board and a member of the Board of Directors of NRWA. So with that, Sarah, take it away and tell us about the rivers.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to speak before such an amazing group of people. My name is Sarah. I live in Shirley, Massachusetts, on the banks of the Squannacook River. I work for this tiny little company called Inter-Fluve, and we do ecological restoration projects in Massachusetts. And you might see us working on dam removals and cranberry bog restorations down at the Cape. I'm a Central Mass native. My background is civil water resources. My specialty is surface water, moving surface water, river hydraulics. And today I am delighted to speak about two issues that I've been curious about and worried about for 40 years, plus years, my whole life: climate change and rivers. So I'm gonna humor me for a minute. I'm gonna start out with a moment of perspective. I don't normally have apocalyptic tendencies, but since Don't Look Up came out at Christmas, I find sometimes that this perspective helps me put the current climate change situation in context. The past century is no longer a reasonable guide to the future for water management. With respect to climate change, I speak as someone who's been hearing about it all my life. I was introduced to the concept in the early 80s when I was a little too young to absorb it because I think it terrified me. Or maybe I was the right age to absorb it because I've been wondering why it didn't terrify everybody. Either it was nothing and we should carry on, or it was the most important thing of our lifetimes and we should stop everything and fix it. I learned about climate change sort of the same summer I learned about the asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs, and a little kindergartner putting those two things together. It was just a disaster. That existential moment where I understood that the certainty that the world could be destroyed, or if not the world, then civilization, and that it has been destroyed before, more than once. It kept me up all night. It made me force my parents to go to church. That's a true story. And it really does explain why I am the way I am in a lot of ways today. For example, when I travel, I take pictures of ancient water infrastructure in places where it doesn't really rain anymore, and where the infrastructure isn't needed anymore because the people don't live there anymore. But it still works. Things as important as civilizations come and go, and then they come back again, and some things are out of our control. Change is certain. But what makes this time around special? What makes our civilization and our situation today special? So now I'm going to take a minute to talk about what I mean tonight when I talk about climate change. And then after that, I'm going to talk about what I mean about rivers, so that we have some shared understanding of definitions, because, well, we'll see. With respect to climate change, the discourse here about climate change in the United States has been stifled for so long. And the arguments that we hear so loudly are so disingenuous. And not one of us is immune to the seeds of confusion that have been sowed deliberately over the past 40 years. And we've been tricked into not believing what we see with our own eyes. The RLC has disappeared between 1973 and today. These are Google Earth images, the timeline. We can see it with our own eyes. The information's there. Even reasonable, smart people, people with common sense, people who've been looking at the data, can come to discover that we arrived to this conversation with no shared understanding of what climate change is. But I know that we all care about it and we all want to do something about it. And we're a little bit like musicians showing up at the orchestra to play a song without a conductor. We're playing the same music and we're starting at different times and playing at different tempos. But we're all here.
Sarah?
Yep.
I just asked, someone asked, where is the RLC?
Oh, the RLC is, oh, you're gonna, my geography. It's flows from the mountains in Kyrgyzstan. It's in the Middle East. It is, it's like on the edge of the Soviet Union, Russia. It's in that part of the world with the old Soviet states, like the Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. I'll stop there because I'm embarrassing myself with my geography, but it's out there. So here's my proposal for this conversation tonight. And the reason why the RLC is disappearing is because they've been diverting the water for agriculture. So it's not just because of climate change. It's, I mean, human influence climate change. So here's my proposal for the conversation tonight. Climate changes. Climate's a variable phenomenon. It would be doing that naturally if we weren't here influencing it in any way. So what I'm talking about tonight is primarily human influence climate change as the result of excess greenhouse gas emissions, notably carbon, via carbon dioxide, and then all the follow-on response of our natural systems to those greenhouse gases. And this there's an animation there. So, and this proposal, this stance that I'm taking here may be a little bit debatable, but even as I say that, I'm wondering if I'm saying that because I'm a scientist, like I want to see the evidence. I want someone to prove it to me. Or if I've been so influenced by skeptics that I don't believe what I see in front of my own eyes. So smart people like we are, we're often doubters. We want to know more. So we proceed with caution, and that might not work for this issue. Humans are absolutely amazing. We adapt our environment to suit ourselves, both to our benefit and to our detriment. I mean, we just experienced our first modern day global pandemic, and we had the resources and the knowledge base to characterize a virus, figure out how it worked, discover and build a different compound that we put into our bodies to protect us, like within a year. Like, we're miraculous agents of ingenuity. And climate change is just, as I define it here, is one of the unfortunate side effects of the last 250 years or so of our industrialization and progress and rapid advancement into nothing humanity has ever seen before. And on this turning of the wheel of civilization, we've found a way to access and use millions of years of stored solar energy in an extraordinarily short period of time. The solar energy was captured by life, by the biological processes on Earth. Life on Earth were carbon-based life forms. There may be a couple exceptions of the deep sea vents, but everything we understand to be life has carbon in it. And when we think of the carbon cycle, sunlight, we have photosynthesis where our vegetation converts sunlight and carbon dioxide into biomass, sugar, carbohydrates, and then fungus, bacteria, all this dead life, the carbon in it migrates into the soils, into the oceans and the sediments, and it is stored in the earth. It's no longer in the atmosphere. But since the late 1700s and early 1800s, we've used those abundant stores of energy to create order in our world. And in so doing, we have all these benefits. We have easy transportation and comfortable homes with lighting and running water, abundant food, refrigeration, and anything else you can imagine delivered to your door from across the world in less than 2 days. We really do have everything, don't we? But our release of this carbon dioxide via fuels, and along with that, continued and relentless but necessary natural solar insulation, all this together is causing warming. And this warming is affecting the land and the air and the water. And due to the nature of these three elements, they all heat up at different rates. And it's these differential changes in particular that are causing changes to the pressure gradients in the atmosphere and affecting global weather patterns. And these changes manifest as hotter weather, more unpredictable weather, stalled weather patterns, all things that we're going to hear more about next month when David Valley from NOAA comes to talk to us about the new normals in precipitation. These weather patterns are changing the distribution of the fresh water on the planet, in our ice caps and in our lakes, and finally, also in our rivers. And here's where I'll make the bridge back to the focus of my topic tonight, which is how climate change is affecting rivers. So thank you for that diversion, joining me with that. So now I'm going to query and challenge your imagination to consider the simple question, what is a river? Easy, right? It's a longish, thinnish body of fresh water, fresh moving water confined to a channel. It starts up high in the mountains or the hills. Thank you, Martha, for this photo. It flows downhill and it collects more and more water until it meets the ocean. This is the Columbia River estuary between Washington and Oregon. And we usually fixate on the water element of the river, but it's not really just the water. It's also the channel. It's the earth material that confines the water in one place. Most of the time confines the water in one place. This is Fort Pond Brook in Acton, just upstream of one of the dams that they're planning to take out soon. And as an aside, the earth material alongside the river is actually pretty bad at holding the river in one place. Rivers are dynamic and mobile. The river likes to have options. It's important to include the floodplain in our mind's eye when we think about rivers. So this image here, it's two images side by side. It's the Saco River up in Conway, New Hampshire. And here's an overhead view. Right now, on a typical day, all of the water flows within that dark blue band. That's what we would normally think of as the river. But if they get a little bit of rain and the river rises, the water quickly spills over into and out of the banks, and it uses that whole floodplain, which is currently occupied by agricultural fields. And the topography there shows some pretty intricate and dynamic overland flow paths and sort of the history of the meanders in that floodplain. Rivers can be very powerful and erosive, especially if you're in an area with sandy soils. And in many areas, it's not the earth that holds the river in place, it's the vegetation, the large woody vegetation, trees. This image here is a bank on the Suncook River up in Epsom, New Hampshire, after a pretty significant erosion event that I will talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. And the vegetation doesn't just contain the form, it also influences the quantity of water in the rivers. Our first accounting might suggest to us that vegetation adjacent to a river depletes the water in the river. This image here is, these two images side by side are a little brook along Squanicook Road a few days before and a few days after leaf out this spring. And you can see as soon as the trees start to draw the water up into their leaf systems, you can see the water come right out of the channel, and you can feel the humidity in the air. So vegetation has a larger role. Trees move the local surface water and the groundwater into the local atmosphere. This process can create local and sometimes even continental weather. The Amazon forest itself makes the humidity that creates the rainforest. And without the forest, it probably won't be, or there won't be the same kind of rain. It won't be a rainforest, but there won't be any rain either. So the river and the vegetation combined can be self-sustaining and self-healing, self-reinforcing. And as long as we don't interrupt that intricate balance that holds them together, they can take care of themselves. But sometimes we interrupt the balance. And now we arrive at the main topic for tonight, the impact of climate change on rivers. I'm going to home in on 3 or 4 different elements that I think are vital to this discussion. And then as a finale, I'll talk a little bit about what we can do to help our rivers and streams protect themselves from climate change. For this conversation, I'm going to propose a 3-legged table, 3 legs and a top. I'm going to talk about water quantity. Frankly, this is what I know best in a traditional sense. I took years of statistics classes at the very edge of my math abilities. It was probably a good idea that I didn't stay at the USGS. I'm going to talk about water quality. My experience with quality comes from practical experience, often related to the regulatory compliance with federal, state, and local, the Clean Water Act, wetland protection regulations and bylaws. And then I'm going to talk about form, the form of the river. My experience with form is not as a traditional geomorphologist. My experience is applied science, very specific to the forces of moving water and how well or how poorly different types of earth, sand, gravel, cobble, boulders, resist that moving water. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, I'm going to talk about the vegetation or the biology. Water quality, water quantity, form, I've been talking so far about stuff that's subject to the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry. Physics and chemistry happen on every planet in the solar system. And if we could change a few coefficients and a few constants and rerun the numbers, we could predict flows on Mars. But what makes us special? What makes our situation special? And it's the life, it's biology, more broadly, the ecology. So the life affects the rivers and the rivers affect life. So we can't leave plants and animals and fungus and bacteria and algae out of this discussion. So the first leg on our table, water quantity. Climate change is affecting the quantity of water available in our rivers and streams. In the Northeast, the intensity of large infrequent storms is predicted to increase by 7% at the end of the century. Floods are getting bigger and droughts are getting worse, and they're lasting longer. But not everywhere, and not equally, and not for the same reasons. So why are floods getting bigger? Global temperatures are rising, and a warm atmosphere can hold more water. And when we have an event like a hurricane, it'll drop more water, especially if it stalls in one place. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dropped between 30 and 60 inches of rain in the Houston area in less than 4 days, breaking records, shattering records. Our record here is, 8 inches or so in 24 hours. So 8 times 4 would be 32. But that's never happened, doesn't happen. It was the wettest tropical storm on record in the US. Climate change is causing a disordered atmosphere and a weaker jet stream. Wet weather and dry weather and snowy weather can park in one place for an entire season. Installed weather patterns can result in incredible accumulations of water. Here in New England, typically February is our snowiest month. And remember, in 2015, it didn't start snowing until the end of January. It stayed cold between snow events. It snowed almost every other day. And by the end of March, we had almost 10 feet of snow, most of it accumulated. Warming weather changes the timing of the spring snow melt. And when spring rains coincide with that melting snowpack, spring flooding can be magnified. Could you imagine if the snow melt in 2015 coincided with warm spring rains? This is a picture of Route 2A between Air and Shirley, just in Shirley along the Nashua River during the spring floods in 2010. And this was just rainfall in the spring. If we'd had rain like that on top of a snowpack, it would have been a disaster. There's the bridge. So far this year, or in 2019, the Mississippi River and the Missouri Rivers remained above flood stage for over 6 months. Farmers couldn't plant, they couldn't harvest, their fields were underwater. And in July 2021, flash flooding in the Ahr Valley in Germany, destroyed a village overnight. And let's remember for a moment that European villages and cities have been around a whole lot longer than ours have. They're where they are because they're in places that have been safe and stable for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. So when a European village washes away in a flood, something's different. These examples are just anecdotes, and no single weather event can be attributed to climate change. What we really need is data, and we need to use this data to evaluate trends. Unfortunately, we don't actually have a lot of data. We didn't really start traditional methods for collecting data on stream flow and on rivers before we started using fossil fuels. So we really don't have a good data record of what was going on with our rivers and streams before. We can't really say. We can only use the clues that remain to us, kind of like the locations of the old European villages. But here in the Nashua River watershed, we do have some data at our disposal that we can use to see if there are any trends affecting our local rivers and streams. And so for this talk, I put together a little statistical analysis on the gauges in the watershed. There's 9 gauges. I did some math to see what I could see. And so I'll walk you through this image right here before I move on. I know some of the images, I'm not describing what they are. They're more to give an impression, but this one, let's walk through it. So the Nashua River, is odd, defies a little expectation, but it flows from south to north. The highlands of Worcester and Princeton are to the west. So the main stem of the river kind of hugs the right-hand side of the watershed boundary. The gray boundaries there are subwatersheds, but the blue lines are obviously the rivers and streams and ponds and lakes within the watershed. Within our watershed, we have the Wachusett Reservoir, which is part of the water supply for the greater Boston area. And discharge from the Wachusett Reservoir can either end up in the natural river like it naturally would if they release it from the dam, or it can be sent, west to the Quabbin, or it can be sent east to Boston. So it's very controlled, and gauges in that area or really represent managed systems. They're not natural systems. But the Fitchburg and Leominster and Pepperell gauges around the main stem Nashua or North Nashua tributary. The Clinton gauge itself is downstream of the Wachusett Reservoir Dam and represents outflows from the dam. We have one gauge on one of the major tributaries downstream, an unregulated tributary, the Squannacook River. And then we have a couple smaller tributaries all upstream of the Wachusett. We've got the Quinnapoxet River in Holden, Stillwater River in Sterling, Gates Brook and West Boylston, Rocky Brook and Sterling. And I don't know much about those, so I'm not going to say much about those, but I'm sure somebody on this call knows something about those. I would, if you have information about them afterwards, definitely put it into the Q&A so that we can all learn a little bit more. So I took the gauge data. I took the daily gauge data and I asked myself the question, are we seeing more water in any given year? Is the total volume of annual flow changing? Is it going up? Is it coming down? Is it staying the same as time goes on? And before we get too far, I'll explain the anatomy of these particular graphs. I have a couple images that look just like this. We've got 9 plots on one sheet. Each plot represents one of the stream gauges. The horizontal axis on the bottom of each plot is the year, and they all have the same axis. They all go from 1925 to 2025, 100 years. The y-axis on these graphs is flow, and bigger rivers have bigger numbers on this axis. That axis isn't fixed, it's variable. The black line with all the dots is the average annual flow per year at that gauge. The red line is the trend line. If it slopes up to the right, the trend is increasing. If it slopes down to the right, the trend is decreasing. And if it stays flat, the annual flow or the annual volume of flow passing by that gauge is consistent. And so here, what I found when I did this quick and dirty statistical analysis, I found that in the Nashua River proper and in the North Nashua River and in the Squannacook River tributary, we do see an increasing trend. As time goes on, we're seeing more and more water in those rivers. We have long data record at the Leominster gauge and the Fitchburg gauge and the East Pepperell gauge. So we might say that we can be relatively confident that that trend is significant. I will make full disclosure here. The statistician in me wants me to let you know that I didn't take the next step and determine if these trends are significant. So this is step number 1 in an analysis. There are more steps, but, and if anybody wants a research project, I can give you my spreadsheet and take it away. What we're also seeing here is the Stillwater River in Sterling, a tiny little tributary, and Gatesbrook and West Boylston are showing increasing trends in total water over the course of the year. And the Quinnapoxet River in Holden and Rocky Brook in Sterling are showing decreasing trends. And I don't necessarily know why this is happening. I don't know if they are part of water supply to Worcester or Holden. I'm sure someone in our audience knows this and might have some insight as to why this might be. I'm not going to get into it. So my next question might be, okay, so we're seeing more water passing by some of these gauges, especially the large gauges on the main stem river. Where's this extra water coming from? Is it the result of more rain distributed more evenly throughout the year? Or are we seeing bigger floods? And is that volume column coming all at once? And then here again, another plug for the next climate change talk in the series with David Valley from NOAA. He's going to answer some of those questions, I think, when he talks about changes in precipitation trends. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Hey, Sarah, this is
Yes.
Martha. Hi. I just want to say that the Nashua River in Clinton is manipulated by the Wachusett Dam, the levels. I think you know that.
Yeah. So keep that in mind. The length of record that we have on these plots is not very long, but it's definitely related to the releases from the dam. Normally they hold back all the water because they want to make sure that we have water to drink out east.
Okay. And if you, if it's possible to increase the size of the side, somebody requested that.
Oh, I don't know if I can do anything.
We get the idea though that things are increasing or decreasing, so that's fine.
Yeah.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I packed it all together. It's always, it's always tricky to show a lot of data. If you do the blurry eye test and you look at which direction the red lines are going, that should be enough. But I can always provide these slides later. Martha, will the presentation, can we make the slides available? People will be able to.
Yes, yes, the recording and will be available.
All right, super. Thank you. For the next step in this analysis, if you can't see the slides, I'm sorry, these are the same format. I plotted up the annual peak floods by year to see if the annual peak floods were changing in time and whether we're seeing increasing trends or decreasing trends. And so based on the gauge data, I found that I think the answer is a little bit yes and a little bit no. Our gauges on the main stem river show mixed results. Peak floods on the North Nashua River in Fitchburg and Leominster appear to be increasing, and those are both sort of suburban and urban watersheds. But peak floods downstream in Pepperell don't appear to be increasing. In fact, it looks like they're decreasing. I wonder if that's significant. I don't know. But the next step would be to figure out if that downward trend is significant. And then tributaries are showing mixed results again. The Quinnipoxet, which is in the top right corner, and Rocky Brook tributaries on the right and in the middle, they're trending down as far as the large floods go. And the Stillwater River in Sterling and Gates Brook in West Boylston are trending up. Let's see. And then I was looking at these data sets, I started to see something in the variability. The plots have these really big zigzags in them, but as we get to the last 10 years, the variability of the annual peaks has kind of narrowed down. And I thought that was interesting. And I don't know if it's significant, but if I was going to continue a statistical analysis, I'd check about the variability of these annual peaks over time. So if somebody wants a research project. So that was about quantity, the possibility that we're observing more water in our global and local rivers as a result of climate change. But, on to the next question. Are droughts getting longer and more severe? And this is a picture of the Rio Grande River. The Rio Grande, poor river, goes dry in certain places almost every year. And they have this really special fish, the silvery minnow, and people literally go out and find the puddles of the river and pick out the fish and save them and put them back when the water comes back. I mean, they're walking in the riverbed. The Rio Grande's a pretty big river. It makes me very sad. So right now, as we enter into the 2022 growing season in the Northern Hemisphere, we're seeing record low levels of snowpack in the Colorado River Basin in particular. Record low levels of water in Lake Powell. The marina is not accessible anymore. They can't really get their boats in or out. The footprint of the impoundment behind the dam there is really, really shrinking as the water goes down. Lake Mead The water supply for Las Vegas is also critically low. So what's at risk here? These record low levels are going to affect California's agriculture, one of our national breadbaskets. And if farmers can't get surface water to irrigate their crops, they make up the difference with groundwater, which is causing another extraordinary problem, the land subsidence. Once they withdraw the groundwater, the ground then compresses, which means that if they did have rain regularly over a long period of time, since the ground is compressed, there's no way to store that water in the ground anymore. And so groundwater in those arid regions out west is not a renewable resource. They can't get it back after they draw it out. Sorry about the apocalypse, but here we go. Right now in India, there have been record-breaking heat waves. This river called the Yamuna River, which I actually don't know much about, but I saw on the news last week, is dry. It flows from the west to the east, parallel to and just south of the Ganges River, or the Ganga River. It's fed by glaciers in the Himalayas. It's used as the water supply for Delhi province and city. It serves about 16 million people. It's needed for their agriculture and industry. And monsoon season, which will replenish it, is 2 months away. Right now in Italy, the Po River is almost dry. The Po River flows from west to east across the northern part of Italy, almost entirely across the northern expanse. This is Italy's breadbasket. Record low snowpack and the retreating glaciers in the Alps have reduced the flow in the headwaters. And the irrigation season has only just begun. River levels are so low, the Adriatic Sea is pushing in and up, and farmers drawing the makeup water from their groundwater wells. That water is coming up brackish, and using this water, brackish is salty. It's got a little too much salt in it. They use it on their crops that could destroy their fields for generations. And all this together as an aside, India's prohibited exports of their wheat for this season because there's so much water stress. Ukraine's fields are obviously out of service, and Italy's season is under unprecedented pressure. This may be a year where we start to see significant global issues with food supply. So it's really important that we keep our rivers healthy. There could be a lot of human suffering. But what do droughts look like in our watershed? It's a little bit more hopeful. The story is not completely dire, especially, given last year we had a record wet year. With respect to low flows, I did a little statistical analysis on the daily low flow record. For every year, I found the lowest consecutive 7-day flow. And here's what I found. Of course, last year throws everything off a little bit. But if the red line points down to the right, low flows are trending lower. And if it's pointing up, then they're trending higher. So what I saw with this analysis is that low flow is getting lower at both gauges in the North Nashua River and Fitchburg and Leominster, 2 urban, suburban watersheds. Low flow doesn't seem to be getting lower in Pepperell and not necessarily along the Squanicook River either. We should note here that the Squanicook River is often referred to as a reference watershed because its contributing watershed is relatively pristine. It's not as affected by development as many other watersheds, even out further west in Western Mass. The watershed's over 77% forest, and it's developed area, which includes residential, industrial, commercial, impervious, and barren land. It's less than 10% of the contributing watershed. And we kind of have a rule of thumb in stormwater management anyway, that once you have human impacts on 10% or more of a watershed, you start to see the effect of those impacts on your rivers and streams in terms of quality and quantity. And the Squanicook River watershed is really sort of like right at that threshold, that sweetheart threshold. Clinton, right there in the middle, doesn't count. They can release as much or as little water as they want from the reservoir. And then the tributaries, the Stillwater River and Sterling and Gates Brook and West Boylston have mixed results. Those flows are so low, you know, it's less than 10 cubic feet per second, and the record's so short, I wouldn't call it either an upward or a downward trend. And then the Quinnipoxet River, which is top right, and the Rocky Brook, you know, they have decreasing trends. But again, I'm not sure those are significant. Those periods of record are very short, and Rocky Brook gauge was, you know, decades ago. We don't have current data. So here's a little summary. This is one leg of our table, water quantity. It's the last slide before we move on to water quality. This quick analysis of the stream gauge record indicates that the total volume of water in our rivers is increasing year over year. The peak floods are also generally increasing, and drought flows may be decreasing, but I think a little more work needs to be done to figure out really what's going on there. So, volunteers for next step. Now let's spend a few minutes talking about the impacts of climate change to water quality in our rivers and streams. As we said at the beginning, it's our understanding that climate change is causing an increase of temperature to land, air, and water. And changes in the water temperature will affect all sorts of things that live in the water. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. And if that water warms up, we're going to lose the ability to support life for the species that need that highly oxygenated cold water. Like, you know, a darling species are trout and salmon. They'll suffocate. And then, so we've seen earlier in the presentation, we've read the news articles and seen in our own data set that floods are getting worse and intense rainfall is getting worse. And rainfall and runoff from those intense downpours carries a lot of material, carries a lot of soil. That eroded soil from lawns and agricultural fields, or in this case, from up in the mountains in Vermont, contains nutrients and fertilizers and other chemicals applied to the land and vegetation, herbicides and pesticides. So funny story about that picture, 4 hydrologists get into a car and drive to Vermont to talk about updating their hydrologic manual to design roadside swales. And we, on our way home on Route 91 or 89 or whatever major highway that goes to Burlington, we captured this image in the middle of a freak thunderstorm. I'm just going to go back for a second. Okay. So that material that washes out during those intense storms ends up in our lakes and our ponds and our estuaries, and often behind dams on our rivers and streams. This is a photo of the sediment behind the dam at the Trap Hole Brook in Norwood. This dam came out in March. We were excavating and mucking out the sediment and shipping it away for most of the spring. So once we get that nutrient-rich material out of there, you know, that concentrated nutrient-rich fine sediment creates pools of nutrient-rich water, which leads to algal blooms and toxic bacteria blooms. And then we experience a bit of a feedback system where algal blooms working alongside with the warm temperatures decrease the available oxygen and cause additional stress and death to the aquatic species that need that oxygen. So that was, you know, briefer than the quantity talk, but that was my brief but not quite comprehensive summary of how climate change is affecting quality in our rivers and streams. And now I'm going to move on to form and vegetation. I'm going to combine that third leg of the table, form, with the top of the table, biology, And I'm going to limit my definition of biology to vegetation because it's too much to try and put it all together and right now. And I think it would, I wanted to, I had high ambitions of putting it all together, but I think that's a life's work, not a month's work. From my perspective as a design engineer for naturalized rivers, my building blocks for design include bed material, like the rocks, and vegetation, trees and other things, trees and shrubs, and grasses and sedges. So now I'm going to show a few pictures to illustrate how the building blocks, the rocks and the vegetation, are interconnected. So here are some images from my local river illustrating vegetation in proximity to the river. This is the Squanicook River from a bank in Shirley looking towards Groton. And in this picture, you can see that the trees have pretty deep roots that extend several feet from the surface, plus or minus 4 feet. And they stabilize the very sandy soils of the riverbanks down to the water level. And where the trees and the roots exist, the bank's relatively stable, and where they don't, the bank is pretty eroded. Here's another photo taken from the same place. And I like this photo. I want to appreciate for a minute the exposed soil profile. I want to ignore that erosion right there and appreciate the profile. This is the soil profile of a densely forested sandy riverbank. We see a very thin needle duff layer on top. We have a foot or two of fine-grained gray sand, and then many, many feet of rich orange-brown sand. And then if you look over to the right a little bit, you can appreciate the shallower roots of the adjacent mountain laurel. And then further appreciate how where there is no vegetation, the bank just washes away. Any little disturbance, even bare feet, can cause significant impacts. And without that vegetation, this bank would be gone. It would just wash away. And so now I'm going to tell you a little story about another river nearby in the Merrimack River watershed that's set in a similar silty, sandy loam floodplain. And occasionally here and there, it has a stone bed where you see the turbulence and the rapids and the riffles. But most of the floodplain is sandy like this. This is a bank. In May 2006, New England experienced a flood. It's often referred to as the Mother's Day flood. The Suncook River in Epsom, New Hampshire, which is also a tributary to the Merrimack, just like the Nashua River is, it catastrophically and dramatically changed course. It was spectacular and apocalyptic. I think it would have been like a train wreck. You wouldn't be able to look away. The primary cause was related to a gravel mining operation that got a little too close to one of the river meander bends. So during this flood, which was a pretty big flood, the river overtopped the banks and flooded that gravel pit. And in doing, it ate away that unstable bank. And it formed a completely new channel. Within hours, the river abandoned a channel length over a mile long. And it took a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of rocks to stabilize and restore, and in some cases, rebuild the infrastructure. There were bridges both upstream and downstream that were affected by this. They had to rebuild and restore some of the water supply wellheads in that area. A lot of the sand moved downstream and deposited at some public water supplies. And I show you this because I want to give you a recent local example of the consequences of removing the stabilizing features of a riverbank in areas with loamy sand and sandy loam. I think people, certainly not the geologists, but people in general thought the river was pinned in place at the rocky deposits, the rocky bed deposits. But it turns out that those rocky bed deposits were only in one little place, and once the river found its way to erode the agricultural fields and to erode the unstabilized banks adjacent to that rocky area, the river moved over to the right, cut down 20 feet, and then that cut, propagated upstream and put the Route 4 bridge in danger. So that's my testimony to you about the importance of vegetation and their contribution to the form and stability of the river. And in particular, so I've been a little bit biased about it, I'm describing mostly large woody vegetation. The vegetation stabilizes our floodplains. It defines the form of our river corridors. It provides natural, low-maintenance, self-healing riverbanks. River corridors with this type of vegetation are resilient, and that vegetation protects and buffers our rivers from the impacts of climate change. So I'll move on to the last part, the finale of my talk. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the conversations, concerns, techniques, and problems that I face in my day-to-day struggle to practice ecological restoration in the face of climate change. What you need to know is that in my entire career, even though I've been looking for it, there have only been a couple places where I have seen guidance that provides recommendations for standard engineering practice related to climate change. And I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm just saying it doesn't come into the standard practice because unless we're forced to, no one wants to pay for it. I mean, that's a weird thing to say, but that's, we're subject to the conditions around us. In the mid-2010s, I started to see recommendations in the Federal Highway Administration guidance documentation indicating that culvert and bridge designers may consider and justify, and by justify, I mean defend the additional costs of incorporating a larger degree of uncertainty into their designs. The guidance documents I was using in the 2010s didn't really, the boring ones, didn't use the words climate change. That's not to say that the Federal Highway Association wasn't concerned with and talking about climate change. They had established a Center for Climate Change to provide guidance back in '99, and they had, renewed the center in 2004. And that's about the time where I came into the workplace as a professional. And the political climate at that time was weird. And lots of federal funding was cut, a couple years later, or I guess in 2003. Right about the time when we went to war with Iraq. And that was about the time that the funding was cut for the program I was working for at the USGS. And, what I saw, my observation was that it got a lot harder to get data, to use data, and to work in research in our government agencies. But what I will say is that relatively recently, various groups have been developing resilience checklists, and I'm really looking forward to using them at the beginning of projects, not as an afterthought in the permitting process when someone asks me to write up an alternatives analysis that fits a project that was already designed. And then one more aside here is that I'll remind you that I'm a licensed civil engineer. And that license comes with a duty first to protect public safety, life, infrastructure, property. And one of the challenges that I weigh daily is what timescale am I allowed to consider when I'm making choices about my duty to protect public safety and life, when short-term measures may cause long-term harm. Do I have to make something that's absolutely safe today? Or can I make something that will naturally grow to be more safe over time? And this often shows up in the internal battle between the use of rocks, riprap, versus vegetation on a constructed riverbank or a constructed floodplain, because the vegetation could die. Sometimes we're building rivers and banks in somebody's backyard. Someone could cut it down, they could burn it, and then what? There'll be no stability there, so can result in over-designed systems with rocks. They're reliable, but they're permanent and they prevent that natural geomorphic adaptation to changes in precipitation and flow patterns in the future. And when I'm designing a project, do I have to think about the forces that might act on the area today? Or do I need to make sure that I look ahead to predictions in the future? How far into the future? Whose predictions should I use? Mass Rivers Alliance states that communities that fail to safeguard their rivers and streams may see instability in their water supplies. Can I use that statement as a justification for softer designs? They also state, quoting from their website, communities that have done the greatest damage to their natural infrastructure, in particular, wetlands, forests, streams, and rivers, will lack defenses to protect them against climate change. So as an engineer, how do I balance the need to create a safe riverine system when safe often means immovable, when I'm dealing with a system that, when functioning properly, is extraordinarily dynamic? That was a lot. Those are my questions. If anyone has any answers or wants to continue to discuss that, it's a conversation that I'd like to have. So what I'm going to do now is present the, probably disappointingly simplified tools that I use to make sure that when I'm addressing a project, I'm addressing it with respect to implications, quantity, quality, form, and vegetation. This slide summarizes the precipitation depths that designers have been using over the course of my career to estimate and predict floods. The red bar on the left represents TP40, Technical Report 40. It's an ancient map put out by the USDA Soil Conservation Service. It was done in the 60s. And let me stop for a second and go over this graph because I realize probably need some explanation. So the vertical axis on this graph is the depth of a precipitation event in inches. It assumes that these events take place over 24 hours. So it's a 24-hour event, how much rain falls in 24 hours. And then the different groupings of the columns of this graph are the sort of frequency. So the 10-year flood event is a pretty significant flood event. You would notice it. It would be hard to get around. The 25-year flood event, you might expect to see that once every 25 years. And the 100-year flood event, you'd expect to see once every 100 years. Back in the 60s, when we only had, a certain number of years of data to sort of predict or, estimate how much precipitation we might expect to see once every 10 years, we only had a few years of data to guess. And as time has gone on and temperatures increased and the atmosphere's gotten warmer and we've got more precipitation coming down in these storms, our newest resource is NOAA Atlas 14, Volume 10, which is the blue column in this grouping. But as part of my work with the city of Cambridge on their vulnerability assessment, we had been asked to use future precipitation predictions taken from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And a woman I was working with, Indrani Ghosh of Kleinfelder, made predictions about the type, the amount of precipitation we're likely to see in big storms in 2030 and in 2070. So far, I haven't been able to justify using those precipitation events in designs. They're pretty extreme. Right now, the 100-year flood is predicted to be 8 inches in 24 hours here in Massachusetts in this location. But in 2030, we can expect that to be 10 inches in 24 hours. And in 2070, we can expect it to be almost 12 inches in 24 hours. That's a lot of rain. We've never seen anything like that here. I haven't been able to use any of these in my designs. They're extreme. But I do wonder, should I make sure my designs can accommodate precipitation this extreme. And now I'll go through a little list of some of the building blocks we use when we stabilize river form. When we do the math to estimate the quantity using the precipitation for, predictable storm events, and then we use the results to determine an appropriate form for the river. And by form, I mean like a width and depth and bank slopes and floodplain slopes and valley slopes. And we design a geometry, both cross-sectional and longitudinal, that will hopefully behave like a natural river. And we use rock and soil and vegetation and large woody debris to do this. Sometimes the rock, this is the Suncook River, and that's Steve Landry from New Hampshire DES. We used rock to stabilize the banks of the Suncook River, where that catastrophic flood occurred, the Mother's Day flood. We use soil to restore and stabilize. We build these little soil burrito chia pets on the banks. We pin them to the soil with wood stakes, with live poles, willow. And that fabric only lasts a season or two. After that, we're really depending on the vegetation to take over and stabilize the banks. We do some novel work with vegetation. We select vegetation that does a couple of things. We need vegetation to grow quickly and stabilize the banks right away. And then we have our long-term plants, typically are tree species. And we aim to create, over the long term, a canopy that will provide shade and protection to the aquatic organisms. I mean, ideally, we'd love to see, we can only hope that one day what we build will look like this. Not if we use all that rock for sure, but when we can get the flexibility to not use that rock in stabilization applications, we'd love to do something like this. Sometimes we build large woody debris into our projects. Sometimes we use, logs with the roots still attached to them to simulate natural wood found in our rivers and streams. On the left, we are building a river in downtown Toronto, Canada. It's the Don River. Stay tuned. There's going to be a river where there was an industrial fill site. Looking forward to it. I think it's going to be great. And to conclude, the final word is that as an ecological restoration practitioner, we can restore nature. Humans are amazing. We have the ingenuity, we have the knowledge, we have the ability. But a mature natural system takes time, it takes care, it takes continued multi-generational support. And it's much better to protect what we have. The inherent resilience of our undisturbed systems is truly the most important tool in our battle to fight the catastrophic potential impacts of climate change. And so, Martha, I'll conclude there. 8:08. If anybody has any questions or discussion, I would love it.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay, so that was great. There was a huge amount of information to chew on. And I will just add I really appreciate the comments toward the end of the dilemma of working in a world that is changing and the responsibilities. I'll just mention for myself, we work with landscape architects, and I've worked on probably 10 or 12 projects in the seaport area of Boston recently. And part of our responsibility is to make sure that landscapes are viable for the future. And we knew from the beginning that in that area, groundwater would rise in storm events and be salty. So we protected the soils from becoming too salty and the ability to drain them afterwards. But about halfway through all that work, new estimates of flooding came out, and several feet of water, of salty water, was going to be flooding this landscape. And indeed, how do you deal with that knowledge that the future is changing, and it would cost a lot of money for someone to protect it, and we're going and building landscapes that are going to have a different set of problems as we go into the future. And I really appreciate your raising those dilemmas that the design community is facing, because it costs money to deal with what we know is going to be happening. So I just want to make that comment. Ralph Baker has a comment here. Says, what do you think about this idea? Instead of using riprap along a riverbank to stabilize it, dig a trench some distance, 10 feet from the river, filling it with rocks so that it would avoid harming vegetation that's currently stabilizing the bank. This was considered to be employed by the city of Fitchburg between the West Treatment Plant and the North National River, just to the south of Fitchburg Airport. So sort of a long question. When you read that again.
Oh, yeah. Well, what do I think about it? I think that it's not a bad idea. It's a great idea. It provides potential future stabilization far away from the water. It avoids the problem of having to do construction work in the water and disturbing the river. It's, insurance for the future, for if and maybe when the water wants to take a turn and you have infrastructure that you want to protect, and you can protect it, but it's insurance for the future. It's not for today. I think it's a great idea. I'm gonna go back in my presentation to the image of the Saco River, because I want to show you, we're doing a study on the geomorphology of the Saco River, and we can see where people have done things like that in the past. And it's not obvious to us, I'm not necessarily looking at, when I'm out there, I don't know the history, but I look at this image, because it's easy to download this information from the web and then take a look at it. And, the first thing that you see here, I see, is that there's a very straight bank adjacent to sort of these low areas. That's their water treatment plant. And so way back in the day, they had put some armoring away from the edge of the river, and over time, the river has bumped up against it. And so then we see evidence of historical protection because there's a straight riverbank. So that could potentially be the future of the project area in Fitchburg, right, in the long term. Not saying it will be, but this is what it could look like to an anthropologist in the future.
Okay, thank you. The other question was from Jacob Yankee. Are rock structures to control rivers expected to last indefinitely? Or is it an infrastructure that needs updating every few decades or so?
Well, it depends. So if you put a rock in the river, it's going to stay there forever. I would say, we've got our fingers crossed. Steve Landry would sweat a little bit if he's heard me say that before, but I'm going to go back to the picture of the Suncook River. You can size material to be completely immobile, by design, and hope that it never sees forces in excess of what will, mobilize. It's the same. It's like aerodynamic, hydrodynamics. The water moves against something, it lifts it and it moves it. It is possible that you're going to put stuff in there that's so big it will never move again. And in this case, in particular, on the Suncook River, we don't want it to move again, and that breaks our heart a little bit, because that river really wants to zig and zag through its floodplain, and we know we've just fixed it in place. I guess I'm saying it's a dilemma. You can make a riverbed mobile intentionally, but you need to know that there's going to be material coming from upstream and feeding back in material that you've put in as it moves downstream. If you have dams and other infrastructure and man-made things that are blocking that transport of material, then you have to pay close attention to what you're putting down.
I would and what I see when I see these long strips of riprap is ecological void. That the banks of rivers are some of the most important ecological niches for just incredible biodiversity. And there isn't much that's going to live there. So they're looking at you, this is looking at the human part of just protecting erosion, but wow, what a loss of ecological integrity. Let's see, there's someone asked, where is the river that you used in the background image? Now, this has appeared several times. I was fascinated with also. Yes.
This is the Squannacook River. This is upstream of Hollingsworth and Bowes, in between the confluence of Pumpkin Brook and Hollingsworth and Bowes.
Neat. Lori Jiao, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. I'm sorry if I missed that. Asked, out in the west in the U.S., where they're using groundwater and have compressed the land. How bad is it over there? What's the percentage of groundwater? What percentage of groundwater is irretrievable out there?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it is known, it's quantified, and it's extraordinarily high. Let's see if I can get back to that figure too. Oh, actually, this is the better way to do it. Land subsidence in some areas is like 20 or 30 feet. 20 or 30 feet over pretty incredible swaths of land. I don't have a quantity. It's extraordinary. Read Cadillac Desert if you need, want something to read. I mean, don't read it before bed. You won't make you feel very good. That's very interesting.
Right, and as the rivers dry up and agriculture needs water, that pumping of groundwater is becoming way more profound. This is a real issue that isn't going to go away anytime soon. So Ralph Baker added to his question about the Fitchburg and the trench of stone 10 feet away, said, I should have explained this was a place where the river's movement is threatening a key water supply line to the treatment plant. So there was another dimension as to why that choice of a solution was made, not just protecting the bank.
Yeah, so the common theme here is protection of infrastructure because it was in close proximity to our rivers. And if that's a water pipe to a wastewater treatment plant, the image I showed of the Saco River, that's a wastewater treatment plant adjacent to the river. Those things have to be close to the river. The big stabilization on the Suncook River is the result of they need to protect the Route 4 bridge, which is undersized for that valley. You really want a valley spanning bridge there, but it's really just a 12-foot bridge on floating abutments.
Okay, so Lori, who asked the question about the groundwater, asked a follow-up question. Her last part of her question was, how bad is it over there? What percentage of groundwater is irretrievable? And then she said 50%, 75%. So I guess the question about what groundwater is not accessible is, I believe, what is being asked.
I don't have any numbers for that. I don't keep up.
Right, well, I'll add a little bit to that as a geotechnical engineer. It depends. If the soils are adequately pervious, essentially all of the groundwater is retrievable. It's where you have either fine-grained soils. With a clayey soil, you can pump forever. You only need a few dribbles out. So it depends more on the types of soil. The depth actually doesn't matter. You can get whatever you want. And then, of course, there's a vast amount of water in the bedrock in seams that, again, is retrievable, but at what cost now? So cost and time become part of the question about the answer about what percentage. Let's see, more questions. That's all we have at the moment.
I just realized, Bob, that if somebody wanted to raise their hand and I can allow them to speak too. I didn't realize I could do that.
Go ahead. Great.
That might be it for questions. Somebody else just popped up.
And there's
Here's Joan had a comment in the question.
Okay, so Joan Watkowitz, another board member, comments. 20 years ago, the upper reaches of the Squanicook was paddleable. Great word. Today, it is nearly impossible with downed trees. Why did this happen so fast? Was this caused by aging adjacent forests or by ice storms and extreme weather events? If caused by climate change, what could we expect the Squanicook River to be like in a few decades from now?
Mm-hmm. Oh, great question. I managed to paddle the Squanicook this spring during high water from Hollingsworth and Bowes up to Bertozzi, but maybe upper Squanicook, you mean above that. And yes, there were a lot of down trees and it was really challenging. But my response to that is rivers and streams, it's always been a natural process for large wood to fall into rivers like that. It's not abnormal. And in fact, a healthy river has wood in it like that. And, would be tangled with log jams all the time. I think we tend to like to tidy things up and get them out of the way. I would say, I love to paddle them too. I think it's great for them to be accessible. And if we're going to do that, just cut out something that's wide enough for a canoe to get through, but leave the wood there because all those tangles of roots and branches are habitat. And the more of those that you have, the more refuge you have for your fish and your, turtles like to hang out on them. And they're natural and they're part of that rich ecosystem. I don't necessarily see the migration of the meanders, like specifically between Hollingsworth and Bowes and Bertozzi as a problem, but if we do anything to decrease sort of or degrade the health of the forest and the banks to, start coming in, they'll retreat one way or the other. And the Squanicook looks, like it's abandoned channels before, so it has been dynamic in the past.
Right. I'll just add a thought on that. Also, my belief is, right, somebody used to take care of it and now they don't, so to speak. The concept of beauty has changed for a lot of people, has changed dramatically for me when I think of small ponds and rivers. I used to think, oh, nice clean rivers, lawns coming down to ponds. And then as I began to study ecology, and I realized, wow, in ponds and vernal pools in particular, it's those branches and trees that have fallen in that create habitat that a whole lot of species can survive. And so my own perception of beauty has shifted over time to appreciate these more naturalized areas where nature has taken its course and people haven't cleaned it all up. And I hope that others in the world start to pick that up also, because it makes a healthier environment to let a lot of nature just take its course. So, I agree with your answer precisely.
No, nature's messy.
Okay, so Ralph has another question here. Any thoughts about the long-term impacts of interbasin transfer, as is common in the Wachusett Reservoir sub-watershed, i.e. water from the Quabbin and the Nashua watersheds on net being shipped to Boston? Is this sustainable?
I have, in my undergraduate years, I calculated the safe yield for the Quabbin Reservoir a couple times. I grew up on the Ware River. The Ware River has a siphon in it, a diversion that goes, from the Ware. They send it to the Quabbin. I grew up like a mile away from the diversion. And then, we have the Wachusett back and forth. Is it long-term? Is it sustainable? I do think that we are at a balance where we're not over extracting from any of those resources. And the water conservation efforts in the late 80s, early 90s actually did a really good job making sure, I think we use less water from the system now, even though there's many more people, because conservation was so effective.
Right, there used to be 300 million gallons a day that was taken from the system, and they're down to around 180 now with conservation. It's remarkable, and that's why they want to expand the system, because the MWRA needs to make revenue from their water, and they're selling less water than they did 40 years ago. So, but the diversion, they were wanted to divert the water from the Connecticut River because they weren't keeping up with the supply, the demand, and folks out in Western Mass said, wait a minute, you've already taken too much of our water. How about some conservation efforts? And it really has been remarkable, how they turned it around.
Interbasin transfers are a big deal, especially, when they have an interstate implication and international implication. Like the Rio Grande and the Colorado River have international agreements because the water shared with Mexico. They're a big deal. I'd say we're sustainable out here, but they're definitely not sustainable in the Rio Grande and the Colorado right now.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions, and we've got a couple here. Anna Barker asks, it sounds like for many reasons, there is a strong relationship between rivers and trees. Healthy forests equal healthy watersheds. Is that right? There's a softball coming right in. Hit it out of the park, please.
Yes. So I work with a lot of people across the country. Inter-Fluve's headquarters are in Hood River, Oregon, and we do a lot of dam removals in the salmon fisheries in the Columbia River Basin. And we have an expert named Marty Melcher, who has often worked with the U.S. Forest Service, and Jim McCartney up in New Hampshire. They have been doing research together on forests and rivers for a very long time. And I had a conversation with Marty last week, and I was like, so, tell me a little bit more about how important the river is, or the trees are, and the forest is to the river. And he showed me some pictures and some examples of different water management strategies or river management strategies or riparian corridor strategies out in the Midwest. And he said that one of the strategies has been to cut down the trees and do long root perennial grasses. And they walk those watersheds after big storms. And they've had quite a few pretty significant storms really close together in the last few years. And any area that they had clear cut and, gone back to grasses is eroded and mobile and, contributing sediment to the water which contributes to problems that, it's just a mess. And any place where there was forest, the river stayed where it was, and it's just there. And so that's what I've been learning. Like, I've been asking this question a lot lately, and that was the example that I got from somebody who writes, how to use large wooden rivers guidance for the U.S. Forest Service.
Okay, so actually, one more question is up here. So I'm going to quote two questions, and then you can sort of deal with them, and we'll wrap it up at that point. The first is from Suzanne Paquin. Could you comment on using invasives like Fragmites for stabilization of riverbanks in other situations? They've obliterated nearby wetlands, destroying turtle habitat. I've never heard of using Fragmites, and it's scary, but and then Rick Mulkey asked, are current state rules adequate to limit timber harvesting near rivers?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about, so when we do ecological restoration projects, sometimes we put into our contracts and our documentation management of invasives. And, does it work or it doesn't work? Invasives get in no matter what. I mean, they are really effective at stabilizing the banks. And so if that was our only goal, I mean, sure, but I don't think we're there yet. I think that we need to protect and preserve what we have. I don't think we should be planting these things. And then, are current state rules adequate to limit timber harvesting near the rivers? Well, I think if the rules there are rules in place that protect, certain bands adjacent to our rivers and streams. And if we honored them without exception, it'd be something. I think I'd like more, but I can't say that they would help with stability.
Right. Okay, so before we wrap up, I just wanted there's a new screen image here, because on June 9th, David Valley, hydrologist in charge of the National Weather Service, NOAA Northeast River Forecast Center, who was given a couple of previous really great presentations also to us, is giving a talk called Torrential Rains from Slow-Moving Tropical Storms, as you brought up about in this. Is this part of the new normal? So this is another sort of coming in at the similar kinds of issues, and the two together really going to teach us a lot about river hydrology. This is great. So I would like to thank you for a great presentation and a lot of real good things to think about, thoughtful, and your philosophical pieces that people often ignore. And I really appreciate your going into that depth about how you wrestle with these. So there's a lot of really good stuff. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming tonight, and hope to see you again.